3 days into Alex's business trip, and honestly, the house felt strangely quiet. I was just about to throw together a quick dinner when I heard the unmistakable sound of our front door opening. My heart skipped a beat, hope flaring up momentarily. Maybe he had wrapped things up early and was back home sooner than expected. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and hurried to the hallway, a smile already spreading across my face. But as I rounded the corner, that smile faltered. Standing in the living room was Mark, Alex's identical twin brother, grinning as though he owned the place. "Hey there, surprise," he said, his voice a bit too casual, a little too cheerful. I stood frozen for a second, my brain racing to process what was happening. "Mark?" I managed, trying to piece together why he would be here. "What are you doing here? I thought Alex was on a trip." "Oh, he is," he replied, his hands shoved casually into the pockets of his jeans. "But I figured you could use some company. I thought I'd drop by and see how you were doing." A rush of confusion washed over me. I knew the brothers were close, but it felt odd for him to just pop in like this without a heads up. Okay, I said, forcing a smile, hoping my uncertainty didn't show. "I guess that's nice of you?" As he stepped further into the house, a familiar feeling settled in, that strange mix of comfort and discomfort. The last time I'd seen Mark was at a family gathering months ago where we'd exchanged pleasantries but nothing more. Now he was standing in my living room, and for a split second, I felt an uncanny sense of familiarity wash over me. After all, they were identical twins. But I quickly shook that feeling away. He was not Alex. "Want to catch up over a drink?" he suggested, his smile widening. "I brought some of that whiskey you like." I hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. The house was too quiet, too empty without Alex, and I suddenly felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on me. "Sure," I replied, unable to shake the sense of unease that crept in with every passing second. We moved to the kitchen, and I poured us both a glass. As we sipped the whiskey, I tried to focus on casual conversation, talking about the weather and the ridiculous reality shows I had been binge-watching. But every time I glanced at Mark, the way he tilted his head or the familiar way he laughed, it struck a chord deep within me, stirring memories of Alex and our life together. Yet, as the minutes turned into hours, that initial unease began to morph into something else. An electric tension hung in the air between us, unspoken and palpable. I found myself laughing a little too easily, leaning in closer than I intended, caught in a web of emotions I hadn't expected. With each joke and playful jab, I felt my guard slipping, the boundaries of our relationship starting to blur. There was something intoxicating about the way he looked at me, as if he could see all the way through to my thoughts, my fears. In that moment, I was reminded of how we used to feel before the everyday grind of life settled in, lost in laughter, in shared stories, in the fleeting magic of connection. But just as quickly, a wave of guilt crashed over me. This wasn't right. This was Alex's brother standing in front of me, not Alex himself. "Let's watch something," Mark suggested, pulling my attention back to the present. I nodded, feeling slightly dazed as we moved to the living room. The weight of my thoughts tangled with the reality of the situation, and as the evening wore on, I felt a storm brewing within me, part longing, part confusion. In the back of my mind, the thought echoed, Alex was out there somewhere, likely busy with work, and here I was, flirting with the idea of an intimacy that felt dangerously close, yet impossibly far away. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm shadows across the living room, the atmosphere shifted. We settled onto the couch, a cozy spot that felt oddly intimate, and I tried to focus on the movie playing in the background. But the tension was thick enough to slice through. Mark's laughter echoed in my ears, and every time he leaned closer, my heart raced. "Do you remember that time at the lake?" Mark asked, his voice low and inviting. I nodded, recalling the summer filled with laughter. "You almost tipped the canoe over because you were laughing so hard." "Yeah, well, I'm not known for my grace," I replied, trying to keep it light. But the weight of his gaze made my stomach flutter. It felt ridiculous to be here, flirting with the idea of intimacy while Alex was miles away. "Maybe I was just trying to impress you," Mark said, leaning in even closer. My heart pounded as I felt the pull between us. I laughed, brushing off the seriousness of his comment, but it lingered in the air, unspoken yet potent. As the whiskey warmed me, the conversation flowed more easily. We reminisced about childhood adventures, and with each shared story, the barriers I had built around my heart began to crumble. Mark looked at me with such intensity that it felt like he was seeing me for the first time, not just as Alex's wife, but as a woman with desires. "You've always been someone I admired," he confessed, his voice low. A flutter of confusion twisted in my stomach. "It's like we're on the same wavelength." "Mark, I hesitated, trying to find my footing. "This isn't right. You're Alex's brother." "I know," he replied, frustration flickering in his eyes. "But it doesn't change how I feel. I can't pretend I don't want to be close to you." A tension pulsed between us, thick and undeniable. The flickering TV faded into the background, and all I could focus on was him. I had to remind myself who I was married to, but part of me was drawn to Mark in a way I hadn't anticipated. "I miss him too," I said softly, grounding myself. "But this isn't fair to Alex." Mark shifted even closer, his warmth radiating against me. "But Alex isn't here," he murmured, frustration and longing mixing in his tone. "And it's okay to feel something more." Before I could respond, he brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my skin. A jolt of electricity surged through me, igniting a fire I hadn't realized was there. My heart raced as the lines between right and wrong blurred. In that moment, it felt like the universe was pushing us together, challenging me to question everything. But deep down, I knew I had to stay true to Alex. Yet with every heartbeat, the connection with Mark grew stronger, complicating the choice I would eventually have to make. The next day dawned with a fog of uncertainty surrounding me. I barely slept, caught in a whirlwind of thoughts about Mark's confession. I missed Alex, but there was an undeniable thrill in the connection I was forming with his twin. Just as I was trying to shake off my feelings, the doorbell rang, sending a jolt through me. When I opened the door, there stood Mark, casually leaning against the frame. "Hey, ready for an adventure?" he said, his eyes sparkling. "I thought we could check out that new club downtown. I heard it's a blast." I hesitated, glancing back at the familiar comfort of my home. "A club?" I echoed, my heart racing, but Mark's enthusiasm was contagious. "Come on, you need a break, it'll be fun." "Okay, why not?" I said, feeling a mix of excitement and guilt. I quickly changed into something that made me feel good and felt a spark of rebellion as I looked in the mirror. The drive downtown was electric. Mark turned up the music and we laughed, the weight of my worries slipping away. The club buzzed with energy when we arrived, and as we pushed through the crowd, I felt a rush of exhilaration. "2 cocktails, please," Mark ordered at the bar, then turned to me with a grin. "To new adventures." "To new adventures," I echoed, clinking glasses, the warmth of the drink and the moment flooding through me. As we danced, the chemistry between us intensified, and I found myself leaning closer, lost in his magnetic presence. "Can you believe how packed it is?" I shouted over the music. "Yeah, but I'd rather be here with you than anywhere else," he replied, his voice low, sending a shiver through me. His hand brushed against my waist, igniting a fire I hadn't realized was there. "Mark," I breathed, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "Let's step outside for a second," he suggested, leading me out into the cool night air. It was quieter there, and I felt clarity mix with confusion. "Isn't this better?" he said, leaning against the wall, his gaze locked on me. There was an undeniable pull, an attraction that made my heart race, but Alex's image lingered in my mind, reminding me of my loyalty. "Mark, I started, but my voice faltered. "Don't think about him," he urged, stepping closer, his voice compelling. "Just be here with me." The storm within me intensified as I stood at a crossroads, torn between desire and the vow I had made. Morning arrived like a bad hangover, the sunlight streaming through the curtains forcing me to face the reality of my choices. My head throbbed, and as I lay in bed, memories of the night before flooded my mind. Mark's laughter, the electric connection, and the way he had pulled me into his world. I could still feel the warmth of his hand on my back, the heat of his breath against my skin. But mixed with that thrill was a heavy sense of dread, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump, but knowing there was no turning back once I did. I glanced at my phone. No messages from Alex, which was normal, but it didn't make the emptiness inside me any easier to bear. I got up, pulled on a pair of yoga pants and a faded t-shirt, and trudged into the kitchen to make coffee, hoping that the caffeine would somehow clear my mind. As I stood there waiting for the brew to finish, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at my insides. I loved Alex. I had built my life around him, our dreams intertwined like the roots of an old tree. And yet, here I was, on the brink of something I hadn't expected, something that felt dangerous yet intoxicating. Just as I was pouring my first cup, the doorbell rang. My heart raced, a mix of anticipation and dread washing over me. It had to be Mark. I hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady myself before opening the door. Sure enough, there he stood, looking casual in a t-shirt and jeans, an easy smile on his face that made my heart skip. "Hey, stranger," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I thought we could grab some brunch? You still up for it?" "Brunch?" I echoed, my mind racing. "I don't know, Mark. I mean, it's kind of early." He stepped closer, that intense look returning to his eyes. "Come on, just a couple of hours. We can talk. I promise I won't bite, unless you want me to." There was a playful lilt to his voice, but I caught the seriousness behind it. I felt the familiar pull towards him, but guilt clung to me like a heavy cloak. "Okay, fine. Just brunch, though." I finally relented, trying to ignore the warning bells ringing in my head. We headed out, and as we drove to a quaint little cafe, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and light teasing. Yet, beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension crackled between us. Every brush of his arm against mine sent sparks racing through me, and I felt myself teetering on the edge of a precipice. "You know," he said casually, taking a sip of his coffee, "I've always thought you were the one who got away." I almost choked on my drink. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light but feeling the weight of his words. "You and I have a connection," he replied, leaning in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's always been there, even if we didn't acknowledge it. I can't help but feel like we're meant to explore this." His gaze held mine, fierce and unwavering, and I felt my resolve starting to slip. "I can't do this," I said, trying to find my footing. "You're Alex's brother. This is so complicated." "Is it, though?" Mark shot back, his frustration evident. "You feel this isn't just me, is it? There's something between us. You can't pretend it's not there." The cafe buzzed around us, patrons chatting and laughing, but all I could focus on was the heat radiating off him, the urgency in his eyes. I wanted to deny it, to cling to the life I had with Alex, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. My heart pounded as I weighed my options, my loyalty to Alex clashing with the undeniable chemistry that sparked between us. As we finished our meal, the air around us grew heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the storm brewing inside me, a tempest of desire and guilt. "Mark," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "This is wrong." "Is it?" "Because I can't keep pretending like this isn't happening. I care about you, deeply." He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine, sending a rush of warmth up my arm. I wanted to pull away, to flee from the intensity of his gaze, but I was rooted to my seat, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. We left the cafe, and as we walked through the park nearby, I felt a growing tension in the air, a magnetism pulling us closer together. I needed to establish some boundaries, to remind him and myself of where we stood. "Mark, we need to talk about this." I finally said, stopping in my tracks and turning to face him. Talk? Or do you mean we need to acknowledge what's been happening? He challenged, stepping closer, his presence enveloping me. We can't just ignore this connection. You feel it too. I know I do, but... My voice trailed off, and before I could gather my thoughts, he moved in closer, his breath warm against my skin. But what? He urged, his eyes searching mine for an answer. Mark, I warned, my heart racing. We can't. But before I could finish, he closed the distance, pressing his lips to mine in a fiery kiss that sent shockwaves through my body. It felt both wrong and incredibly right all at once. I melted into him, the walls I had built crumbling under the weight of desire. For a moment, nothing else mattered but the two of us, the fire igniting between us, the sweet, forbidden taste of intimacy. But just as quickly as it began, the kiss broke and reality crashed back in. I stepped away, my breath coming in quick bursts, panic coursing through me. What did we just do? I gasped, my heart racing. Mark's expression shifted to one of desperation. We can't ignore this anymore. I know you feel it too. It's time we embrace what's happening between us. In that moment, I knew I had to make a choice. I loved Alex, but Mark was igniting something within me that I had long buried. I felt the pull, the temptation to step over that line, but at what cost? The storm of emotions raged within me, and I realized that my next move would determine everything. The air hung heavy between us, charged with unspoken words and fierce emotions. I felt dizzy, a whirlwind of confusion and desire swirling inside me. Mark stood before me, his eyes dark with intensity, waiting for my answer. And in that moment, the weight of the choice I had to make crashed down on me like a tidal wave. Mark, I can't just forget about Alex, I finally managed, my voice trembling slightly. I love him. Those words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, but as I said them, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping over me. The warmth of Mark's kiss still lingered on my lips, and my heart raced, torn between loyalty to my husband and the undeniable chemistry sparking between us. Do you really, though? He pressed, taking a step closer, his voice low and insistent. Because if you did, you wouldn't be standing here kissing me. You wouldn't be feeling this way. His words struck me hard, rattling the foundations of my resolve. I had been living in this constant state of longing, and he was right. The connection between us was real, electric, and unyielding. I never asked for this, I protested, frustration bubbling up inside me. This wasn't supposed to happen. You're Alex's brother. It felt like a feeble defense, but it was all I could cling to in that moment, a lifeline in a storm of conflicting emotions. Maybe that's the problem, he replied, his voice softer now, almost tender. We're always looking for reasons to hold ourselves back, but sometimes life throws unexpected things our way. Maybe we're meant to explore this. His eyes searched mine, pleading for understanding. I wanted to scream, to shake some sense into both of us, but instead I found myself taking a step back, desperate to create distance. Mark, I can't do this, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have a life with Alex. We have dreams, plans. This, I gestured between us, feeling the heat radiating off him. This is just a moment, a mistake. But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at me. Was it really a mistake? Or was it a chance to discover something deeper within myself? He took a deep breath, his expression shifting from desire to determination. I'm not asking you to leave him. I just want you to be honest with yourself. We've shared something special, something that's hard to ignore. If you really think this is just a mistake, then why do you keep coming back to me? Why can't you let go? The question hung in the air, heavy and taunting, and for a moment, I was lost in the depths of his gaze. It felt like he was peeling away the layers I had wrapped around my heart, exposing the raw, vulnerable part of me that yearned for something more. I don't know, I whispered, a pang of anguish hitting me hard. Maybe because I'm scared. Scared of what this means, scared of what it could destroy. His hand reached out, brushing against my cheek, sending shivers down my spine. You don't have to be scared of me. I'm not trying to replace Alex, I just want to be part of your life. Just think about it. What do you want?" I felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to tremble, the cracks widening as I stood there, teetering on the edge of a precipice. What did I want? The question reverberated in my mind like a haunting melody. I wanted to be happy, to feel alive again, to rekindle the passion that had dimmed over time. But I also wanted to honor the love I had for Alex, the commitment I had made. "I can't choose," I said, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "I can't just turn my back on everything we've built." Mark stepped back, the disappointment evident in his features, and the moment of intimacy we'd shared slipped through my fingers like sand. "Then, maybe this is where we part ways," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But just know that I'll always be here. You don't have to pretend with me." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to tell him that I didn't want to lose this connection, this moment of clarity, but I also knew that I had to make a choice. As I stood there, the weight of my decision crushing me, the realization settled deep within my bones. Life was about choices, about the paths we took, and the roads we left unexplored, and in that moment, I knew I had to decide who I was and who I wanted to be. "I need time," I finally said, my voice trembling with uncertainty. "I need to think." "Take all the time you need," he replied softly, the warmth in his gaze flickering with something I couldn't quite place, understanding, maybe, or even acceptance. But as I turned away from him, walking back toward the familiar safety of my home, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. The choice was mine to make, but the consequences would ripple through my life in ways I couldn't yet fathom. I was left standing at a crossroads, a storm brewing within me, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. All I knew was that whatever decision I made would alter the course of my life forever.